Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the launch of the Fondation Abi-Saab pour le droit international et la justice sociale. International law and social justice are two categories that suffer today. International law is breached under our eyes, with an international community unable to find the right reactions to this blatant disregard of its legal system. The very concept of social justice is disingenuously insulted by a South American head of state. Et pourtant, and yet, these two tools remain indispensable if we wish to contribute to the construction of a more peaceful, sustainable, and just world. The Abi-Saab Foundation has been created thanks to the generosity of George, with the purpose of promoting the development of international law for the achievement of greater social justice between states and peoples, as well as in internal societies. It is our honor and our commitment to continue the legacy of George Abi-Saab through the activities of the Foundation, favoring the causes of social justice from an international legal perspective. International law and justice are intrinsically linked. Article 1, paragraph 1 of the Charter of the United Nations refers to the principles of justice and international law. Article 2, paragraph 3, while requiring the peaceful settlement of international disputes, invokes the purpose of not endangering not only international peace and security, but also justice. In his general course at the Hague Academy, George explained his sensitivity by telling us, I quote, his firm conviction that things are perfectible, that the feeling of justice, or rather injustice, is a powerful driving force of social dynamics, and that international law, like law in general, is not totally alien to this purpose, nor totally absent from this dynamic. I have to say that this is my own translation, but I'm happy to announce that George is working hard with the English version of his general course. All George's work, through his academic writings and courses, his public interventions, acting as counsel and advocate, as judge and arbitrator, testifies to this commitment: the right of peoples to self-determination and the right to development in particular, found in George, their earliest defender and promoter in the international legal academic community. To launch this foundation, we thought appropriate to organize a debate around the components of its name, and hence to examine the links between international law and social justice. I thank my colleague Nico Krish, the head of the Department of International Law of the Graduate Institute, who will moderate the panel. And of course, last but not least, we look forward to hearing George for his final comments and reflections of this event. But before that, I give the floor to another member of the Foundation Board, Dr. Homayoun Arfasade, also one of George's students, who will address the plans and objectives of the Foundation. Thank you very much.
Distinguished colleagues, students, we have a panel, who will be indulging deeper into the subject that was just touched upon by Professor Cohen, the link between social justice and international law. I'd like to say just a few words on another link between the man and the subject, between George Abi-Saab and the subject of international law and social justice. And that link, I tried to find a word for it, and I came up with humanity. Probably the link between the two is humanity, an endeavor to give a humane aspect, humane dimension to every aspect of social life, including between nations, people, and states. The humanity has been central to George Abi-Saab's work from the beginning, at least from when I know him, nearly 40 years ago, more exactly 39 years ago, when I sat for the first time on a bench and I heard him teach international humanitarian law. And since then, I was amazed by one aspect of his career, how much all his students love him. And I always ask myself, what is the reason? What is this attraction that he has always had? And that I found, again, in that human aspect. The fact that he always tried to have a conception of international law, promote a conception of international law which is humane, which considers humanity as central and transcendental to legal activity, international legal activity, cosmopolitan legal activity. And that's probably why his students all over the world continue loving him. At his anniversary, we have people who, decades after having graduated from different universities where he has taught, they show up again. I've never had that fortune where I teach for 2 years and when I cross a student afterwards in the street, they highly blink at me. So I thought, this is probably not for me. I better do something else than teaching, especially when I had seen the case of George Abi-Saab. So the foundation is a reflection also of his thought, his personality, his conception, that there is no law or rule of law, be it international or otherwise, worthy of the word law if it doesn't serve justice, social justice, in the sense of justice for all and not just a few, including and especially in the field of the community of nations. We, with this foundation, would like to keep that flame alive for as long as it takes, and to support, promote, assist, abet, by any means possible, through the foundation, a conception of international law that serves justice for all. The foundation would start its activities soon. We're beginning next year with 2 prizes for distinguished work of scholarship. One would be the prize of Rosemary Abi-Saab, which would be devoted to a work in the field of international humanitarian law. And the second one would be a prize of George Abi-Saab for general international law. Later, we would expand the activities, hopefully, of the foundation to cover other grants, prizes, supporting distinguished exceptional students, exceptional works of scholarship, PhD thesis, probably an annual conference, seminars, so forth and so on. Whatever we can do to promote the idea that law and international law should be at the service of justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Humayun. Thank you, Marcelo. Thank you especially, Georges. It's my great pleasure to be able to moderate this panel tonight. It's a special pleasure for me. I don't have as long a history back with Georges as you have, and not as an intimate one, because I only came here for a year as an exchange student from studying law in Germany in 1993 and 1994. But then I had the pleasure to take your course on United Nations law. And I think still hold it in my memory as probably the best course I've ever had in law school. And that was in part, I think, really about the humanity that was in there, the dynamism, the excitement, the appreciation of the real political constraints in which international organizations and the UN operate, but also the constant invocation of the possibilities, not quite utopian, but sort of realist utopias that could be achieved through international organizations and the United Nations. So that has been inspiring at the time. It has been inspirational ever since, along with your work, your scholarly work on that and other subjects. And so I'm particularly pleased to be able to moderate this panel, but because I'm just the moderator, I'm not going to say more myself on the topic of social justice and international law, because we have three eminent speakers who will address the subject today from different perspectives, from different geographical backgrounds. You can also say that is testimony to the global reach of Georges' thought and work. I'm going to just briefly introduce them in the order in which they will speak, and I'm not going to say many words because you want to hear them and not me speaking about them. So on the panel tonight, well, on the panel virtually, so that's we've gotten used to the hybridity of life, and so we're going to have two of our panelists online and sort of more than human size hovering above us. There we're going to see them. Okay, so, and I hope Philip will also be there. Is he also connected? Yeah. All right. Good. So we have on our panel first Philip Alston, who will, I hope, appear. He's there. You have to be technically more savvy than I am to navigate this. Great to see you, Philip. Philip is, as many of you will know, the John Norton Pomeroy Professor of Law at New York University Law School. He has occupied too many functions related to international law and social justice than could be mentioned here, only to mention one, that he's been the chair of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights for several years. He's also the author of some of the most influential works on international human rights law, and I'm not going to start mentioning them because otherwise the day would be over. Great to have you with us, Philip. Then we'll have Jorge Vinuales, Harold Samuel Chair of Law and Environmental Policy at the University of Cambridge and also Research Professor of International Law at Luis in Rome. He is kind of a long connection with the Institute, both as a student and as faculty. Also, he's published widely, but I think everybody on the panel has really. So I'm not going to mention this, maybe the last your book on the international law of energy that came out a couple of years ago with Cambridge University Press. And last but not least, Mary Ellen O'Connell, who's just finished teaching, so she is spared a bit with speaking until the end of our line. Robert and Marion Short, Professor of Law at the University of Notre Dame Law School. Likewise, many works, and most recently, and maybe most evocatively, The Art of Law in the International Community that came out a few years ago with Oxford University Press. All of them really come from very different theoretical and practical perspectives to the topic of social justice, but that should precisely be animating for our panel. And without further ado, I think I just leave it to Philip to start us off.
Can you hear me? Yes?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. It's a genuinely immense pleasure to be here tonight to celebrate the launching of the foundation and also to have the opportunity to discuss the broader topic of social justice in international law. I want to start with just a few substantive comments, but I will not speak for long. I think it is possible for the only superficially informed observer to think that international law is very much concerned with social justice and that a great deal of that body of law is directed towards that objective. One can start, of course, with the UN Charter, as Marcelo quoted earlier. One can go even earlier to the establishment of the ILO, which particularly under Wilfred Jenks used the term social justice to characterize its overall objectives. One can look at the focus on development in the post-World War II era, going through the establishment of various specialist organizations, the adoption of development decade strategies, the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, and most recently the Pact for the Future. We can look at the international human rights regime, which appears to have a pretty significant social justice dimension. We can recall, as we do often these days, strangely, the new international economic order aspirations. And we can fast forward to all sorts of discussions now about intergenerational equity, climate justice, and the like. And so one might conclude that international law is really heavily concerned with, devoted to the promotion of social justice. I think the reality is actually very different, and that there is a striking contrast between the number of concepts and principles reflected in international law that have a clear social justice dimension and their actual impact. And I think it's important for international lawyers not to be misled by the doctrinal facade which can be constructed by those wanting to claim that international law has a major social justice focus. I could go through different areas of different regimes of international law, but I will do that only very briefly. I think if we take the area of international human rights law, which is the regime that most would assume is perhaps the most attuned to social justice, what we find is that the system for the promotion of economic, social, and cultural rights is radically underdeveloped. The UN committee established in 1987 has generated a lot of output, has, I think, illuminated the conceptual underpinnings of the area and made a lot of jurisprudential pronouncements. But that work has had remarkably little impact on the actual functioning of the vast majority of human rights institutions and arrangements, whether at the international level or the domestic level. I'll come back to that briefly in a moment. If we look at international economic law, we come across references to social justice in a great many contexts. But again, if we look at the actual practice in a lot of the relevant areas, and I'll also come back to this, it would be very hard to conclude that social justice has been one of the principal focuses, let alone outcomes, of international economic law. Finally, let me say that the rubric that would be identified by most observers as the most relevant, and that is the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, which, if you were to listen to the official UN discourse, is the guiding document for the entire system, etc., etc. The Sustainable Development Goals have failed to a very significant extent. And that failure is built into the way in which they have been constructed. I won't go into it in great detail now. The failure is increasingly recognized by a significant range of independent observers, although the UN itself continues to adopt documents like the Pact for the Future as though all is well and no major changes are required, at least in the strategy. The key dimension here that I would point to as a development that fundamentally undermines the social justice objective is the extent of privatization. That's a term that covers a great multitude of practices these days, and certainly doesn't relate back to the wholesale efforts by Pinochet and Thatcher and Reagan and others, but it arises primarily in the form of so-called public-private partnerships. And if you look at the Pact for the Future, there are endless references to that. Development actors generally, the World Bank in particular, the World Bank being effectively the international privatization organization, push this line that development will never take place unless there is a very active public-private partnership. And what that means in effect is that the public sector is being left with many of the responsibilities and risks, while the private sector is essentially relied upon to achieve most of the Sustainable Development Goals. That recipe is certain to fail because the private sector, by definition, cannot be the key actor in achieving social justice for at least the bottom 20% of populations, but probably significantly more than that. So that element of privatization, which now dominates the development agenda at the international level, seems to me to run very directly contrary to the goals of social justice that the international community purports to be aiming at. Let me finish, though, by talking about several more positive dimensions, I suppose. The most important of all is to take economic and social rights seriously. And it's fascinating to me, although also depressing, to see that Marty Koskaniemi, for example, delivered a paper to the Institut du Droit International last year on social justice in international law with a program for the Institute. He addresses the role of economic and social rights, but he says that the well-known problem has been their so-called declaratory or aspirational nature that has so far often meant that no public or private entity has been identified as legally obliged to put them into effect. Extraordinary. These obligations attach to governments. There is a very considerable jurisprudence as to the detailed nature of the obligations. To say that no public or private entity has been identified as legally obliged to put them into effect. The analysis then goes on to look at extraterritorial obligations as though these are going to provide the key answers. I just want to say that until and unless the very concept of economic and social rights is actively accepted and promoted at the national level, efforts to promote social justice internationally will not get very far at all. Second, I think if we look for positive signs in today's world, we see a growing reparations movement built around slavery, colonialism, and so on, and intersecting significantly with the claims for climate justice relating to global warming. I think those movements have a lot of potential because they are putting on the table the question of responsibilities for the poverty and other disadvantages suffered by a great many peoples in the world. And I think it's a very encouraging development. I would end by saying that I think, bizarrely, there is probably more potential for promoting social justice in those areas of international law proper which don't mention the term social justice. What I have in mind, for example, is the tax treaty that is being negotiated at the international level now. If international taxation arrangements could be made equitable and not dramatically, radically slanted in favor of countries of the global north, that would make a huge difference to the overall situation of social justice and the potential, at least, to take economic and social rights seriously at the national level. I also think, and this is in a way where Georges comes into the picture, that there is immense opportunity available in areas such as the ones that he worked in. Georges has often called himself someone who was parachuted behind enemy lines in different contexts, like the World Trade Organization, in the arbitration field, and so on. And I think it is actually in those areas that arbitrators, international judges, and others could make a pretty dramatic difference in terms of taking economic and social rights seriously, in terms of systematically integrating the social justice impact of the various principles and doctrines that they are applying. So, in other words, I think what we see is a human rights regime which is struggling very much to be effective in promoting social justice as opposed to legal justice or freedom type concerns. And we see an international economic system that is not attuned to social justice nominally, but that offers very considerable potential for doing that, if only more of the individuals involved in those regimes would follow the lead of Georges Abi-Saab and taking the many opportunities that arise in those settings to really explore the social justice implications of the various decisions that are being made, and to try to adjust and reframe some of the doctrinal law, which could be aligned much more closely with social justice. I'll leave it at that, just again to say what a great privilege it is to be with George and to be able to speak on this really important occasion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip. This was rather bleak to start with, but there were some glimmers of hope, maybe in the end. I hand it over to Jorge.
Thank you very much, Nico. And first, let me start with an emotional note. I think for me, it's a great honor, really, to speak at the launch of the Fondation Abi-Saab pour le droit international et la justice sociale. I'm an indirect student of Georges. Georges retired in 2000 when I was actually starting to be a student at the Graduate Institute in the famous licence. So I had the chance to actually cover and learn a lot of what Georges had taught through the teachings of Marcelo, through the teachings of Robert Kolb, through the teachings of Vera Golden, who quite sadly passed away a few years ago. So for me, it's really a great honor to speak at this launch, and I do it really with an emotional note. I had just come back to Geneva from Rome, where the two commissions of the Institut de Droit International that are dealing with the issue of justice, Commission 10, which is on distributive justice that I co-chair with Professor Samantha Besson, and Commission 16 on social justice that Marty Koskaniemi chairs. And I'm glad that Philip actually read the text. That sometimes when we're working on those issues, we have the impression that no one is taking any note. So it's good to hear that they are being looked at. But at the same time, it's important what Philip says. It's important to mention that it's very difficult to frame the topic. Very, very difficult to frame the topic, because at the same time, the Institute could look at the topic in a way that deconstructs the issue, or it could look at the topic in a way that builds something. And for my part, I always try to heed Georges' advice, formulated in so many different contexts, that critique is not enough. And in his closing keynote to a conference held in Cairo on third world approaches to international law, Georges noted with his usual wisdom that it is necessary to bridge the gap between theory and practice, and I quote, mere criticism is not enough. To be really effective, it has to be accompanied by positive suggestions to repair deficiencies and inequities, not just any general abstract and fanciful suggestion, but a legally credible proposal. Now that's a high bar. And what is a legally credible proposal with respect to inequity? One form of inequity that also Philip mentioned, that has turned a small fraction of humanity into a destructive force of geological proportions, with massive adverse impacts, particularly for the most vulnerable states, communities, and individuals, and not just for present generations, but also for future generations, and even for non-humans. So the essence of climate injustice is formulated concisely in the latest IPCC report that was published in 2023. And I will just quote two very brief excerpts from the summary for policymakers, because that summary for policymakers is approved line by line by all governments, including the world's polluters. And just two very brief quotes. The first, human activities, principally through emissions of greenhouse gases, have unequivocally caused global warming. That's just the first part. We know what the cause is. But the second part is much more unsettling. Vulnerable communities who have historically contributed the least to current climate change are disproportionately affected. That's a very carefully crafted language, approved line by all governments, to say that the very issue of climate change is unjust. Now, for 2 decades, climate negotiations have been unable to address this problem. And what is an alternative, credible, legally credible proposal in this context? I would like to say a word about that. Since 2019, I have advised the Republic of Vanuatu in a long quest to bring climate injustice before the International Court of Justice. The screenplay unfolds in 3 acts, and this is something that I'm taking from George as well, where he actually, in the article that I was mentioning earlier in his keynote, he actually ran his screenplay in 3 acts too. So in the first act, the issue of a credible legal proposal is particularly important because it has to be brought before the General Assembly of the United Nations. And we really had to field over the 3 years in which we worked to bring this issue before the General Assembly and thereby before the court. And finally, we had the resolution adopted by consensus on the 29th of March of 2023. We really had to field hundreds, literally hundreds of comments and suggestions for change of the wording of the resolution. And of all that, I will just single out and mention one single thing here, one thing that struck me, and it's still present in the text of the resolution. And that is a tension between a so-called forward-looking question and a climate justice question. So when we started with the draft said, what are the legal consequences of this conduct? In the course of negotiations, a number of states, I will not mention them here, started to ask for a forward-looking question. In other words, a question just about obligations. Just what are the applicable obligations? Now, the problem with that, and we knew it from the start, is that the negotiation strategy was to reach a tension that at the 11th hour, in an attempt to find a compromise, would just drop the second question and keep the first. That's what happened in other advisory opinions. Now, Vanuatu and a number of other states that were looking at the climate justice issue very seriously, they stood firm. And we do have the second question, and that question reads, what are the legal consequences for states where they, by their acts and emissions, have caused significant harm to the climate system and other parts of the environment with respect to, and you have 2 categories of victims, states and then individuals and peoples of the present and the future generations. Now that's the first act. It looks successful so far. But the second act, it's a bit more challenging. It does have a ray of light in it. So the second act is a written proceedings before the court that have just been completed. So I will just single out one aspect of that second act that I think is very promising for social justice. And that's the fact that there was an utterly unprecedented number of written statements submitted before the court, 91 written statements. And later in the second round, 62 written comments. Now, that would be impressive to some extent, but far less impressive if the usual suspects were always there, but not the new voices. And what is really encouraging is that for many states and for many international organizations of the Global South, this was the very first time that they appeared before the court. And they did so, in many cases, with their own strengths, not relying on international counsel. And I will mention something in passing because I think it's opposite in this present context, which is just, for example, to take the case of Burkina Faso and to take the case of the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States. They were both represented by a graduate, a PhD student from, a former PhD student from the Graduate Institute, Professor Mamadou Javier from Burkina Faso. And Mamadou was actually representing his own country, but also the largest organization, international organization of developing countries. But there as well, there in those many written statements and written comments, you still need another credible legal proposition. You can't simply go there and say, this is unfair. And at the heart of the entire proceedings lies a simple issue, which is that a certain conduct of states, acts and omissions leading to large cumulative emissions of greenhouse gases over time, is scientifically acknowledged to have caused not just significant harm to the environment, including the climate system, but catastrophic harm in the form of climate change and its adverse effects. And the question that arises is this conduct consistent or inconsistent as a matter of principle with the entire corpus of international law? And here I would like to make a tragic parallel to something that Marcelo was mentioning between the lines at the beginning of today's conference, which is a reference to the crime of genocide. To paraphrase Raphael Lemkin, the intellectual father of the Convention Against Genocide, who said, why would killing an individual be banned, but the same would not be true of killing millions? In the same vein, how could the most serious form of interference with the environment, the conduct that is responsible for climate change, not be unlawful if basic incidents of transboundary pollution are indeed unlawful? That takes us to the third act, which is still an open question. The hearing will start on the 2nd of December of this year. But I would like to mention something very briefly, that whatever the answer given by the court, there are two different processes that are unfolding here. One took stage before the General Assembly and now the court, but there is a second process, the other, no less important, which has already mobilized and equipped dozens of developing countries, which until then had never attempted to have their voice heard before the ICJ or other international courts. I have not said much about this other screenplay, other than the fact that many hands, when suitably empowered, can conspire to bring more justice. And I will end my very brief presentation here recalling one of Georges' favorite quotes from the Persian intellectual Omar Khayyam, which I have slightly modified for the purposes of today's presentation, which is, "Ah, Georges, could you and us with fate conspire to grasp this sorry scheme of things entire? Would not we shatter it to bits and then remold it closer to our heart's desire?" I'm sure that the Foundation will help us do that. Thank you very much.
I see traces of evolutionary and revolutionary action in this call. Thank you so much, Jorge. We turn somewhere on some screen to Mary Ellen O'Connell. I hope she's with us still.
I'm with you. I can hear you.
Okay, very good. Now we can also see you. Great. Mary Ellen,
on the very big screen. Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Nico. And most of all, thank you, Georges. I was trying to remember when we first met. It was so long ago. And it's been one of the pleasures of my long career in international law to have known you. And you constantly inspire me. The very last entry in our new casebook on international dispute resolution is your own analysis comparing negotiation and adjudication. Please continue your great work. But today we're celebrating the establishment of a foundation that honors you. And at the same time, we're celebrating the reintroduction of a concept, the concept of social justice. When I was a child growing up in various impoverished Midwestern cities in the United States, this was a very common phrase, social justice. It was just taken as a given that this is what we would orient our lives toward, working for social justice. People went into law to have a career in social justice. And I think the Foundation and many other indications that we've just heard about, the work of the Institut de Droit and so on, shows us that we're moving this way again. This is the point of our students' careers again, and I hope of so many of our colleagues. We've been asked to specifically address the links between social justice and international law. And of course, there are many, we've heard about some, but I want to emphasize two. First, the common orientation between both social justice and international law toward community and peace, and away from individualism and violence. And I also want to emphasize the links, the fact that social justice's preferred means of implementation is through peaceful means. And this is also the preferred way that we implement, enforce, honor international law, through the peaceful settlement of international disputes. Well, the phrase social justice refers to equality, fairness, a standard of living for all that supports a life of dignity. It is opposed to discrimination, marginalization, and deprivation. In a recent article on environmental justice, an author describes the dimensions of social justice as recognitional, distributional, and procedural. Similarly, all law, including international law, exists to support peaceful human relations. It does so with substantive principles and procedural means that resolve disputes on the basis of fairness, treating like cases alike. Law is built on equality. In contemporary international legal theory, we trace these basic concepts of equality and peace to the Stoics, whose influence began on Cyprus around 300 BCE. The Stoics made a pivotal contribution to international law through the realization of the common universal fact of order, of harmony, and of proportion in nature. They and their successors looked to such transcendental sources as nature to conclude that all humanity can and should live in harmony with each other and the natural world. People are naturally inclined to social life in community, and that means a life that requires some order and some settled expectations set out in law. People's social nature is a universal fact, and it supports international law's claim to universality. It explains why humanity has always felt the need of some system of rules, however rudimentary, to regulate inter-community relations. International law is part of this and is as old as the conduct of relations among identifiable political entities. Law is oriented to both supporting the individual and her freedom, but also solidarity among individuals and communities, a willingness to forego individual advantage for the good of society. Law is oriented toward achieving social justice through peaceful means. We heard from Philip about examples in international human rights law where there are substantive principles in line with social justice norms. And we heard from Jorge about the need to protect the natural environment, and I would add, as a good in itself. But in accomplishing these desiderata, the means must be peaceful. Law's care and concern for each human person and each human community means that we must promote peace, teach and practice the means of peaceful settlement of disputes. We must correct the permissive contemporary interpretation of the law against war. International law prohibits the use of force, except in the most exigent circumstances, and then only to the extent and for such time as needed to enforce the law of social justice. Notions such as humanitarian intervention or responsibility to protect through military intervention, counterterrorism through war, national security through targeted assassination, self-defense through preemptive attacks, self-determination through invasion, promotion of democracy, even liberation from oppression and other human rights violations through war are antithetical to international law and social justice. The methods of peaceful settlement of disputes, as set out in Article 33 of the United Nations Charter, protect social justice while implementing it in a way that violence and armed conflict, war cannot. It is time to seize this moment. For these methods, they are capturing the world's imagination, peaceful methods, as the dignity of the International Court of Justice at the Peace Palace contrasts with the devastation of Gaza, Khartoum, and Kherson. As my historical and definitional sketches try to indicate, both the concept of social justice and the concept of law depend on the understanding that humanity is social. While the individual survival instinct is well known, the capacity for altruism to truly sacrifice for the other is true too. Altruism is a necessary aspect for achieving social justice and the successful rule of law everywhere. We are nearing the end of an 80-year period in the West in which understanding the social aspect of humanity and the need for altruism for successful social relations and successful law have radically diminished. Individualism, materialism, and militarism have triumphed, pushed by the ideology of political realism and the relentless move away from the universal and the transcendent. Realism, materialism, positivism have inverted the very purpose of law. Realism promotes belief and violence in war, regardless of its legality, regardless of morality, and in my view, even regardless of any success. Belief in war accounts for the long years of America's pointless fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq and its relentless, ongoing campaign of targeted killing. It explains Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Sudan's civil war, and the Middle East catastrophe we are watching unfold, and so much more. Instead of a common bond to support peaceful social relations, law is used to rationalize violence for individuals to maintain control of their governments and control of wealth. This change of attitude toward the authentic underpinnings and purposes of law began with the thinking that arose in late colonialism in Europe in the 19th century, this anti-natural law, pro-positive law period. It launched a renewed interest in social, and it really lasted until the Second World War. And then we had a short period of time in which interest in social purpose of law, in natural law, was renewed. But by the end of the Cold War, realism had reasserted itself, materialism had reasserted itself, and returned to international law, substituted certainly within the United States. In our foreign and security policy, realism is now dominant, international law an afterthought. As a result, realism has exercised extraordinary influence through the NATO countries that follow the United States, regardless of the policies that it's pursuing. They have gone so far as to create a false version of international law to have the best of both worlds, to try to tell the world that they're complying with international law, that they care about it, while at the same time freeing themselves to use military force to exercise certain economic policies without regard for the social, without regard for the international community. They're calling this new conception, this re-envisioned idea, the rules-based Western international legal order. But it's just a cover for pursuing lawless policies of war, environmental destruction, and disregard for so much suffering in opposition to legitimate international law and its embrace of social justice. The so-called rules-based order is a hegemonic legal order in which Western democracies, led by the United States, have one standard for their conduct and another for the rest of the world. It is a system of double standards that I have recently argued is reintroducing the so-called standard of civilization that was used to attempt to justify late European and American colonialism. At the center of the rules-based international order are self-serving versions of international law rules on the use of force, endlessly malleable versions of self-defense. I have some understanding of the intellectual and cultural reasons why the US has led in this effort. It's harder to understand why so many other states that we thought had learned the lessons of violence and colonialism would go along. Understanding the intellectual causes of today's weak commitment in so many places to social justice, international law, and international institutions, and the resulting violence and collapsing environment and social fabric should foster renewed interest in building accurate explanations of law and its purpose. Promoting interest in building accurate explanations means, and the means of implementing through peaceful means, is the work that the Abi-Saab Foundation will carry out. And it will lead to a realization of equality and dignity everywhere. It may be a very dark moment, but we have dramatic examples, such as the new foundation. But also, as Jorge was just mentioning, look at the example of the International Court of Justice, or this new method of resolving trade disputes that's growing up alongside the paralyzed World Trade Organization, or the excitement at the Law of the Sea Tribunal. To focus just for a moment on the International Court of Justice emerging as a major institution of international law that it was always meant to be. We all remember the drama of South Africa's legal claim facing Israel's. I'm very proud that Adila Hassim, who argued for South Africa, earned her doctorate at Notre Dame. She is the example I present to my students, but I also present to them the excellent argumentation presented by Tal Becker for Israel. It is important to emphasize that the courtroom is not a battlefield. It is not a place of zero sum. It is not a place where one loses and one wins when it's the International Court of Justice. Any state participating in the peaceful settlement of disputes, in the Palestine Advisory Opinion case, and so many others, when they participate, they are building international dispute resolution, the peaceful settlement of disputes. They're participating in that process, and there is no losing. The only loss is when an order of the court is not fulfilled. Israel did not lose by participating. They lost by not complying with the court's orders, its preliminary orders to follow international humanitarian law and basic human rights in Gaza. But I need to say a little bit more about some of the other exciting examples that are going on now. Look at the other shift that's happening, the other side of Georges' examples of adjudication, but also negotiation. The new locus of negotiation, of world discussions, is happening in the UN General Assembly. We've seen this major shift from the UN Security Council, which is now also paralyzed through the actions of those permanent members, to the place perhaps it should have always been, the UN General Assembly. I'm particularly paying attention in my own work to the initiatives by the Secretary General working through the UN General Assembly to create a fair world of access to advanced technology. I'm part of a global commission on promoting responsible use of artificial intelligence in the military domain. And I'm really promoting global institutions to ensure that international law, the jus ad bellum, the jus in bello, international human rights law, is honored by states that are using artificial intelligence for military operations. I think the greatest place where we're going to get that kind of support is in the UN General Assembly, using global institutions such as the International Tribunal or the International Telecommunications Union. That's where we can ensure access to technology for all, access to technology that complies with international law against war and in favor of international dispute resolution. The Abi-Saab Foundation can rekindle the alternative to violence to the achievement of social justice. It can emphasize Article 2, Paragraph 3, that mandate to settle disputes peacefully, and point out how very limited any right of a state to lawfully resort to force really is. The Abi-Saab Foundation can renew altruism, the sense of social justice, and the priority of peace over war as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you so much. I think all of our speakers have given us somewhat two sides of the bigger picture. They've all identified concrete areas in which progress can be made towards the realization of social justice in international law, battlefields or not so battlefields, sites of intervention in the courtroom, outside the courtroom, in negotiations and the like. But they've also all kind of pointed out how big the gap is, what an uphill battle it really is to instill international law with questions of social justice in a world that, as Mary Ellen has said, is driven by other forms of action, rational, individualist, materialist, as she's pointed out, in contexts that are dominated by privatized market logics, as Philip has initially kind of pointed out. So there's obviously a tension there. We now have not so much time to address the tension, but we have a few minutes at least, kind of in which we can invite some questions from the audience to the panelists. And in the end, we're going to have some time for Georges to respond to all of it together. There's some things you can pick. There are too many things, I think, on the table to kind of say something about all. All right, so for 10 minutes or so, or maybe even less, we have the chance to have some questions from the audience. If anybody is willing to break the ice. Yeah, maybe state your name and...
Yes. My name is Sarah.
Maybe wait a second, okay. Because for the online connection, they need the microphone.
My name is Sarah. I'm a diplomat in the permanent mission of Egypt, and I'm always proud that I hold the same nationality as Dr. George Abi-Saab. We all, the diplomats in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we are always proud, and we always refer to his work and his contributions that helped my country and a lot of the developing countries. Your conversations or your contributions here actually touched me a lot, because it reminded me of a lot of difficulties that diplomats from developing countries face, especially today. I just came from negotiations on one of the texts, and one of the deadlock was the words, the term unhindered access to vaccines. I never imagined that this could harm anyone. Intellectual property could be saved, but or protected, but when it comes to vaccines, I cannot find a rationale in opposing such a thing. And also, I can say during also negotiations for the responsibility of transnational corporations, we can say that these negotiations reached a deadlock. And we have the conference of Red Cross and Red Crescent very, very near, and we faced not challenges, but we weren't able to even have during this time a reference until now to respecting and ensuring respect of international humanitarian law, which was frustrated for many of us during these days. But this I can understand, maybe. But when we speak about unimpeded access of humanitarian assistance, we weren't able to incorporate it in the resolutions of such a big conference, and this affected me a lot, and I was really questioning. I don't know what I'm doing, and the effect of the multilateral forums. So my question is for Dr. George, if he can give us advice as diplomats, and I want also to know how we can have how to have the best use of your work as academia in our when we reach a deadlock for a just cause in the multilateral forum. When Philip also said, he was talking about privatization. We hear sometimes people talking about we need the voice of the private sector be reflected in the multilateral forums, and while I don't know, while stopping or impeding very, very just causes like what I mentioned. So if Dr. George just can give us advice on this, thank you.
Thank you so much. This was yet more on your plate, George, I think. So, all right, maybe one other brief question. André Philippe, we might have very brief responses from the panel, and then we hand it over to George.
Oh, thank you very much to everybody. It was really interesting. So I have a question for Professor O'Connell. So maybe just to have a clarification. So it seemed to me that you put in the same basket positivism and realism and materialism, and I was just wondering, are all those concepts the same to you? Because in my, sorry for my voice. So in my view, I think positivism can be part of the solution, having a clear legal regime, knowing what are the rules, also core obligations, etc. So I was wondering, what's the problem with this notion, in your opinion, if there is one? Because I felt that it was put in the same basket as realism, which I tend to perceive as two very different things. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I think that would be the start of a long debate. All right, maybe Marianne, do you want to briefly comment? Maybe whoever else on the panel, or Philip, would like to come in briefly before we hand it over.
Yeah, I'd love, Nico, for us to have a debate sometime at your institute on materialism, positivism versus natural law. I think we're overdue for such a debate. And that's in part why I inserted in this, and congratulations to the questioner, because yes, I intentionally added that slight, that inclusion to create some controversy and maybe a chance to discuss natural law a little more widely. So positivism is a form of material. The theory of positivism is based on the material aspect of consent. So in international law, treaties require consent to this document, this material production, as well as customary international law, which is based on practice. So there has to be some material fact of that. And when there's only positivism, which we're seeing, for example, in the US's approach to the law and the use of military force, it can be endlessly changed. You just change your consent, you change your practice, and then what do you know? Within a few years, you have such strange doctrines as we can use force when another state is unable or unwilling to act in a way that we want. If you put positivism within a frame of natural law, which is enduring and based on transcendental sources and is not subject to mere consent, the simplest definition of natural law is law that is not based solely on consent, practice, material bases, then you can limit through, for example, Jus Cogens, what kind of agreements you can make by consent. It is, natural law provides both the basis for why consent binds, but also the outer limits of what is never to be consented to: genocide, the use of military force without a narrow justification, as found in the Charter. So that's why the US has been using positivism alone to advance a materialist and realist foreign policy, whereas if we return to classical international law, pre-Cold War, pre-19th century colonialism, we will find that it was all natural law, and that natural law is essential to having an appropriate form of positive law. But as you know, I could go on, and I'll stop there until you invite me for a full discussion.
Thanks. We will, in due course, we will do. Jorge, do you want to say something?
I just want to hear George at this point.
Okay. Philip, do you want to have a response, or?
I would just say that the example given by Sarah from Egypt of the pandemic and the extent to which social justice determined the outcome in relation to vaccines is a very good illustration, I think, of where we are at. But like Jorge, I'm more interested in hearing about the successor to the Ford and Rockefeller foundations and how the founder sees that
All right, so thank you all. Thank you to the three panelists, really, kind of, for very inspiring and stimulating thoughts that you shared with us. Now, in the good tripartite structure that Jorge has already outlined, we come to Act 3. The most important, as anybody who goes to theater knows, kind of that's where all the answers are given. And therefore, I invite Josh to share with us his thoughts on social justice, international law, and whatever other discussions we have had.
No, thank you. I always say when they invite me to speak sitting that I eat sitting, I speak standing, but I can drink in both positions. As I have to speak, I prefer to stand. Dear friends, I consider everybody in this hall as my friend because he has accepted to waste an hour or two of his life to hear and participate in this gathering in which I am involved. After hearing all the very dogged interventions of my predecessors, I wondered what is left to me. In fact, I had asked to bring down from my office, which I cannot reach any longer because I have to go through steps, the few small library I had about the concept of justice, of equality, social justice, economic justice, the ethics of redistribution. There is a whole thing, and then I decided it's a hopeless job to try to synthesize and come out from all this by something which can be interesting and can be said in a few minutes. So I will speak first on my personal evolution in this field. In fact, growing up in what used to be called an underdeveloped country, later on we changed the name to developing, which is a pure hypocrisy, because if the country is developing, then we don't need all that is being said about how to develop it. And later on, but in fact, what makes all these countries come together is that they are, in spite of their large numbers, they constitute in the international system the periphery. They are not in the heart of decision making. They are not the ones who decide to take the main decisions. Anyway, growing in an underdeveloped country as a middle class boy, I felt from the beginning some unease, not specified or articulated about the way the upper and middle classes looked at and treated the general people. And the idea of that something is wrong there had worked in my mind when I got to the age of reading and understanding in the latter part of high schools, and not to speak of the university. So I thought that something had to be done. And of course, at that time, in the late 40s and early 50s, the world was boiling. It was the aftermath of the Second World War. There were a lot of hopes, but a lot of frictions, a lot of international economic doctrines, schools, and so forth. So all that led me to understand that it is basically a question of justice in society. And that, of course, was more concretely illustrated when I decided to study law, because in the law school, law is based on an idea of general rules that apply to all in equal ways, equal rights also, and so forth. And I said, so how can we improve the situation we are living in, which was bothering me? And I hesitated between studying economics, because of course, economics is a very driving force, and the feeling of justice or injustice, which someone has quoted, the feeling of injustice was, in my view, and is still, a great mobilizing force of social dynamics. So where can one study something which helps to make social dynamics go in the right direction in trying to remedy injustice? So first I thought of economics, but I also thought of international law, because I could analyze much of the problems we are suffering in our own country was a result of the strings attached with external interests, all the concessions, all the treaties, unequal treaties, which were binding not only Egypt, but all the third world countries. And that international law can perhaps help in at least revealing, if not unraveling, these strings attached which reduce the possibility of these countries to take their destiny in their hands. And this brings me to the interface between law, international law, and social justice. I am not going to speak, as I said, I abandoned the idea of going through the literature and making a synthesis and perhaps going beyond it, because it's a work which needs much more time. I was thinking simply of very concrete aspects where law and social justice can coincide. First of all, if we take international law, as was so well explained by Professor O'Connor, all the crises, the dysfunctions we see, the first step to go towards justice in general, not only social justice, is to try to find a reaction to it. But how can a system of law which has no protecting shell, like can change, can impact society? In fact, in a discussion with Philip Alston at the American Society in 2017, which is published in the proceedings of that year, I said that international law is like a being without a skin. He has no skin to protect him from the environment. So the interaction between the legal system and the environment is more intense, and the body of international law is more affected by the environment than vice versa. So the result of that is that such law, which has no, what in French they call carapace, which has no shield in the form of the state, which takes the responsibility for applying the law and can, by this way, impact much more society. How can such a system righten the wrongs, face the those who violate the law but are strong, are the hegemons? It's very difficult for such a system to do that. And that is the system of classical international law, a system which itself came out of a long war, the wars of religion in Europe, when each of the fighting forces tried on ideological reasons to wipe out the other. But when they couldn't wipe out the other, they had to find a way to coexist in spite of their differences. Whence came the formula of sovereign equality, that each prince is sovereign in his territory and in his functions as a sovereign, but he has to recognize the same thing for the other princes. And that law of coexistence, as Professor Friedman, Wolfgang Friedman, has called it, is a law which imposes simply obligations of abstention. Don't intervene in the sphere, territorial or functional spheres of the other. And there is no super state which can police the facts. So when these rules are violated, international law, in order to save itself, tries to find excuses. For example, if we take territorial invasion or annexation, it tries to find doctrines of prescription, acquiescence, whatever, in order to remedy, but in favor of the status quo. So that is really a system which is not at all inspired by justice. That's classical international. Now, even there, modern international law, the law of the Charter, had tried to produce some antidotes. International law cannot unravel the results of aggression. But what it can do is to sterilize them legally by obligations of non-recognition, by deciding that all the other members of the international community should not deal with the aggressor as if he is the sovereign of what he has occupied, for example. Still, this is not will not change the things on the ground, but it does not make them, with the work of time, become a status juris. There are, and there it comes into my mind from my work on wars of national liberation, that if international law is a weak party, like a weak party in a war, you cannot have confrontations face to face, because obviously from the first shot, the weak will be wiped out. But it has to use techniques of guerrilla by increasing the nuisance value of violation. By, for example, personal criminal responsibility for those who commit such violations, like boycotts of products coming from the occupied territories and so forth. Ostracism is also important. All that, of course, does not take us very far. But there is a tendency, a little bit, to reduce the injustice of the classical international law. And if I may add here something about natural law and positive law, which a question which was raised. In fact, the last one who was speaking in terms of natural law, but in fact tried to traduce it into positive law was Vattel. But at the end, it's positive law that took over. Returning now, all that has nothing much to do with social justice. Now, my hope is that we are, and I return to this Summa Divisio of Wolfgang Friedman, which I consider it one of the greatest insights in law of the 20th century. He contrasted this law of coexistence, which is a law based on abstinence, which has no organs, so that Kelsen can say that the state is the subject and organ of international law at the same time. But how can you be at the same time the policeman and the accused? There is something which makes it rather absurd. Wolfgang Friedman divided international law into two parts. One of them was the law of coexistence, and the other is law of cooperation. Now, law of cooperation is a very different type of law because it is based on the idea of a community of values and community of interests. What do I mean by that? I mean that there are certain interests that are new interests that are felt in society. And these interests cannot be satisfied or adequately satisfied by the action of the state uti singuli, acting individually. The only way of satisfying them completely is to do it with the other states, because they deal with public goods which are not divisible. Well, peace is, of course, one of the basic public goods, the first good. So even the law of coexistence aims at that by abstinence. But, or there are values which comes into the conscience of the people, all peoples. And these values, again, become more and more imperative so that they have to be protected. So these common interests and common values can only be served, satisfied by common or collective action. Now, collective action cannot be left to states individually. They must be, because states are unequal in fact, though they are equal in traditional law. So you have to have mechanisms to use the capacities of those who can and to distribute the desserts or the results according, to some extent, according to needs. This means that the implementation of such law needs institutions and needs collective management. And it is through such institutions that the idea of social justice can be brought to a greater extent into the corpus of law. This is clear from what Jorge had mentioned about global warming, the reduction of biodiversity, all these things which are clear to our eyes. But they are also in other fields which are less clear. They are also in the use of the new capacities that science provides and that can be of great use and more diffuse utility through the collective management of these. Now, I think personally that states, whether they like it or not, are being drawn towards the law of cooperation because of the increase of situations where these common needs and common values, but common needs particularly, are becoming more visible. And the more the humanity becomes more integrated, I mean, globalization and so forth, we speak a lot of globalization, but that makes all humanity more interdependent. And this interdependence itself requires the approach of the law of cooperation. And with the universal participation, that's very important. So after all, the decolonization has had at least this benefit that you cannot exclude easily certain states from common endeavors. They participate and you have to take them into consideration. All that will lead to greater legal institution based on the law of cooperation, which can be put into the service. They have to be, but even in their structure of universal lawmaking will have to be taking more into consideration the requirements of social justice. At least that's how I see things, and I hope that we can all work in our different specialties and fields to strengthen these strengths, to increase what unites us and trying to reduce what divides us. Of course, again, this is easier said than done, but I think that the objective conditions will lead to humanity in this direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, George. The only shortfall of your intervention was that it was so short. I would have liked to hear more. But thank you so much for leaving us on an optimistic or kind of optimistic note. I'd already feared that tomorrow I'd have to go into the classroom and teach the guerrilla tactics of international lawyers as the starting point. But maybe there's more to the law of cooperation that we can still exploit and that we've heard about tonight. So I thank all the panelists. Special thanks to Georges. And I'm very happy to announce that the Foundation generously invites all the friends of Georges who are assembled here for a little reception upstairs. And I hope we can continue our conversations there. Thank you all so much, and thanks to Mary Ellen and Philip, who won't be able to join us for the reception, but gratefully they're here.